into the carpet. Feeds it flowers at dusk and comes to light usually in small numbers. Lady's bed straw.
My name's Amanda Thomson and I'm a visual artist and writer, and I'm based in Strathspey in the Scottish Highlands and Glasgow. Imago Imagines is the first work I'm going to talk about, and it's a video installation and sound work. Imago is a word for an adult moth. Imagines is the plural. And I'm really interested in these moths, which are so important for the ecological health of the country, of the environment, and so important as indicators of biodiversity and things like that. And what I wanted to do in Imago Imagines is just to bring these moths that are so unseen into the public gaze. One of the things that's lovely about moths are the names for them. A lot of them were named in the Victorian era, so what you'll find is that the moth names are just incredibly beautiful, poetic, lyric. So you'll see one wall contains a whole list of just some of the species that were captured in Strathspey and Abernethy Forest and kind of the Cairngorms area over the course of a season. One of the other things about moths I found fascinating when I started kind of looking into them more was that some of them were described as common, some of them were described as local, but there was one or two that were described as immigrants, nationally scarce. But the word immigrant really kind of struck me as something quite remarkable to hear in the context of moths, the fact that moths actually migrate, the fact that moths are actually immigrants. But I think just how potent that word sounds in whatever context that you look at it. There's other pieces also kind of on smaller monitors in Imago Imagines, and these are flowers that are kind of captured over, I guess, again, the course of a year. And what I find really beautiful about these flowers is these are the flowers that are sometimes called weeds, they're sometimes passed over, but actually when you start to pay incredibly close attention to them, not least for the day-flying moths and bees and hoverflies that land on them, the flowers themselves are just incredibly beautiful. So I'm really interested, I suppose, in how we connect and the interconnectivity between people, flowers, plants, and how we all kind of come together and interact.
My name is Annalee Davis. I'm a visual artist and I'm usually based in Barbados in the Southern Caribbean. Barbados has been heavily mapped from the 17th century, but very often when you look at maps, maybe you feel that you're distant from the mapping. And so I'm doing a kind of a counter mapping or an interference into these contour lines as a way to include other objects, other things in the environment that make me feel maybe more grounded or rooted to the place. There's a work called Drift, which connects to the ritual of walking. So Drift includes contour lines from the Scotland district of Barbados, which is on the east coast of the island. And it's where Scottish indentured labour were marginalised onto this poor clay-like soil at the end of their indentureship. And on that part of the island, I found these objects that I did drawings of. They're sargassum, they're sea drift, drift beans, and they kind of float around on the wall in the exhibition. F is for Frances. Is also on ledger pages. Frances was a young woman who was referred to in Thomas Applewhite's will. Thomas Applewhite wrote a will in 1815. He owned the sugar plantation, which is now a dairy farm, and that's the place where I live and work. And he referred to Frances in his will as his favourite girl slave. The word favourite is a code for lover. And of course, this was a very unequal relationship, we can imagine. Frances didn't have a surname, so it's very difficult to trace her lineage. But he wrote about her more than anyone else in his will. I've drawn Frances's name out over 7 ledger pages, and I have formed the letters of her name with the shards that I found in the soil as a way to suggest there's an incomplete rendering of who she was, but also a way to make her visible.
The Wok Drawings came about after asking questions for me about moving through space. The small etchings, well, they're photopolymer etchings, are a series of works which identify walking through space doing specific tasks. So each of the Wok Drawings relate to a specific task that's being carried out. And what really interested me about these walks was that they really didn't pay as much attention to the contours or paths of movement that you would expect. And for me, these lines became the idea of how you walk as mark making, how that idea of taking a line for a walk almost writ large. The bigger Wok drawing started, I suppose, during, before lockdown, but what lockdown made us all have to do was only take walks from our house. So what the large Wok drawing does is actually just reveal, it's a composite drawing and it reveals countless walks from my house. So you'll see there's a very kind of, a very dark kind of circle almost in the middle or in the centre of the drawing, and that's my house, and all the walks kind of taken back and forth from it to build and build and build this story of place. Twin Flower is a 2-screen video essay about the twin flower, which is a beautiful, rare in Scotland, quite rare in Scotland, delicate flower which is found kind of in very particular areas. It's found in native Scots pine woods, and there are fewer numbers of twin flower than there used to be just because of habitat loss. So the essay starts off really just about what it is to seek and to find the twin flower, and that idea of, again, slow movement, walking and noticing. But one of the other really interesting things about twin flower is its Latin name, which is Linnea borealis, and it's named after Carl Linnaeus, who's regarded as being the founder of the taxonomic systems related to plants and flowers and how they're categorised today. One of the interesting things, though, about Carl Linnaeus, which takes this beautiful flower and spirals it out, is that Linnaeus was also responsible for categorising human beings, and the ways in which human beings were categorised actually is seen to be, I suppose, foundational to some of the scientific racism that kind of casts its long shadow today. So I was really interested in how this tiny, unobtrusive plant kind of spirals out to create all these other links with ideas of, I suppose, immigration and the word immigration and how that relates to moths as well as people and how people are seen.
There's a work called What's the Opposite of Erasure? Brings together 2 publications. One is the Atlas of British Flora, which maps out the flora of the British Isles. And then I came across a book by David Dobson, who is a Scottish-based scholar, and he wrote something called Barbados-Scotland Links, and it listed over 2,000 Scottish people who came to Barbados from the early 17th century to the mid-19th century. The people that came from Scotland to Barbados would have included planters, bookkeepers, overseers, administrators, prisoners, and indentured labourers. There was also this term used called spirited away, where people were picked up off the street and were put onto these vessels and sent across the Atlantic against their will. What's the Opposite of Erasure kind of brings together the Atlas of British Flora with the names of 152 women that I found in David Dobson's book. And these women were listed as a secretary, a time-expired indentured labourer, Janet Hill, who was a rioter from Glasgow, came in the mid-18th century. And there were 15 women from the Edinburgh Correction House who came on 2 vessels in 1663 and 1665. And very often the archives that we have access to tend to be from the voice of the white male planter. And my interest was to think about, maybe stories or lives that we don't often come across. And I've transcribed the names of these 152 women into the Atlas of British Flora to make their lives more visible. Also in the room is a work called Charms. There are 7 embroidered works. And again, they are on objects that have earlier lives, found pieces of lace that I got at sales. And then I embroidered objects onto them. And these objects are drift seeds or sea beans that I found while walking on the east coast of Barbados. These are organic objects that come in on the east coast of Barbados, but they also, some of them come onto the west coast of Scotland. They're brought through the Gulf Stream. And I kind of wondered when these 152 Scottish women came to Barbados, if in this very foreign environment that they found themselves in, if they possibly recognized some of the sea fruit that came in on the globe's ocean currents, kind of thinking about a diasporic drift that impacted both the lives of humans and the organic material that came in. So these are very common things that we find on the coast, but they're often overlooked as unimportant. And so I picked them up and I brought them to the studio and wanted to attach them to these small bits of linen or crochet or laced objects that women would have made. And I thought of them as charms, these kind of acts that link to the practice of using incantations and charms, which in my research, I learned that Scottish women in the Highlands used incantations and charms in their Gaelic practices of healing, as did the enslaved Africans in Barbadian society. And I imagine that when these women came to Barbados, they may have interfaced with people in enslaved African society, and I wondered whether their practices of obeah or the Gaelic practices influenced one another and hybridized in some way. The work that I'm sitting in front of here is called Bush Tea Services, a series of teacups. It's an imperfect tea service, so it has embedded in the teacups shards that I find when I walk in the fields of Walker's Dairy, which is the place where I live and work. And these shards are from the late 1700s, the early 1800s. Some of them came in as ballast on the ships from the UK. And the red clay ones, which you can see here, are pieces that I find that are made with local soil, local clay that we find in the soil in Barbados. For the purposes of this exhibition, I collaborated with Tarika and produced 2 special teas, which we served and will be serving throughout the exhibition. And the idea is to kind of think about serving tea as a small act of reparation. It speaks back to the British tradition of drinking tea, which was grown on plantations in China and sweetened with sugar from plantations in the West Indies. The abolitionist Robert Southey referred to it as a blood-sweetened beverage. But in contradiction to that, I'm offering healing teas that are made with plants, some of which, for lightly tendrils, plants that could be found in Scotland and Barbados. So we were using here hibiscus and plantain and ginger and different plants for the serving of these kind of teas to help people to slow down and to take in the work and to have the experience of that.